Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Ethics for Lunch. My name is Mark Hughes. I'm the co-chair of the Ethics Committee here at the hospital. Ethics for Lunch is our monthly forum sponsored by both the Ethics Committee and the Berman Institute of Bioethics to talk about issues of relevance to the hospital community. And today we're going to be talking about allocation of resources when there are shortages of drugs.
I'm Yoram Unguru, John, Terry, my co-presenters and co-panelists. If you guys understood that CME thing, today is going to be very easy. Let me assure you. And you guys are going to be doing the heavy lifting. What I'd like to do is give a brief background about some of the chemotherapy drug shortages and drug shortages in general. And then I'm going to present the case that you have in front of you. And your job is to figure out how you want to allocate it. So I'm a pediatric hematologist oncologist. I'm also a bioethics type. I've been involved with the shortages for the past 5 or 6 years, pretty much every day, much like my co-panelists have. I've been doing this as a clinician, as a bioethicist, and there's been some progress, but we're still not there yet. So let's get the background stuff out of the way so we can get to the more interesting things. So drug shortages have been around for the past decades. Actually, you can go back to the early 1900s with insulin, the 1940s with penicillin. But over the past 10 plus years or so, they've certainly become more common, and this includes chemotherapeutics. And this involves not just chemo drugs, not just supportive care drugs, but really drugs from all classes, critical care drugs, antibiotics, essential electrolytes and minerals, etc. But over the past 10 plus years, this really has become an issue. And presently, there's almost 200 drugs in short supply in the United States. And I'll repeat that for effect. There's almost 200 drugs in short supply in the United States. And Michael Link, who's a pediatric oncologist at Stanford and recent past president of the American Society of Clinical Oncology, really summarized it most aptly, I think. You can see what he said. Although we've had shortages before, we've never had as many, nor have they lasted as long. And there's sites here that I've listed for you that you can get up-to-date information on these shortages. Our focus today really for our case, though, is going to be the particular chemotherapeutic, but we could certainly swap that out with other drugs. Now, when it comes to chemotherapy, most of the drugs that are impacted by these shortages belong to this class of sterile generic injectables. But when you look at all drugs on the U.S. short list, not just chemotherapy, anywhere from 50 to 75% belong to this class of sterile generic injectables. And it's really important that we appreciate that these injectables, they make up the backbone of proven and life-saving regimens, not only for kids with cancer, but for adults as well. And because so many of the drugs that we rely upon in peds oncology in particular come from this class of sterile injectables, in my field, we're very impacted by these shortages, probably more so than some others. So these next few slides are courtesy of a colleague of mine out at Utah, Erin Fox, who runs their drug information service and does yeoman's work, and I want to thank her for sharing them with me. And what you see here are the number of new drug shortages each year in the United States beginning in 2001. And you can see that 2012 was the first time in 5 years that there wasn't a new record. You can also see that up until September 30th of this year, there have been 120 new drug shortages. So I'd argue that even though we have fewer new drug shortages, the fact that we still have anywhere from 100 to 200 new shortages a year is not good, and we have to do something about it. Here you see the breakdown, and this data is very timely. Look, it's not even 2 weeks old, or it's just 2 weeks old. Here you see the number of active drug shortages by quarter. So although there have been fewer new drug shortages each year, the fact that we haven't been able to resolve existing shortages is why we still have almost 175 drugs in short supply right now. And this is the breakdown by top 5 classes of drugs that are in short supply. So John can tell us about all the critical care drugs that he experiences that are in short supply. You can see the number of chemotherapeutics that are in short supply. Essential electrolytes and minerals. I'm sure you guys remember here in Maryland, just last year, we had shortages of normal saline. So essential electrolytes and minerals, calcium, zinc, et cetera, et cetera. So solving the drug shortage problem will ultimately require a major policy shift, one that's grounded in coordination and cooperation. But until that time comes, and that time isn't here yet, as a society, we need to be prepared to make the difficult decisions about how we want to divvy up scarce life-saving chemo and other drugs among equally deserving patients. And this is now where you guys get to do some of the heavy lifting. So let's review the case. Actually, before we review the case, let's see what some smart people have said about the best way to allocate. So here is a very busy slide, and what I've tried to do for you here is summarize what 4 thoughtful groups have said about the best way to allocate. And you can see that all 4 agree that the primary value should be medical need. You can also see that all 4 agree that we shouldn't just favor the worst off. But after that, it's not so clear cut. You can see some of the people say we should do first come, first serve. Some say we should not, and probably the most honest don't know. And the same applies for this notion of lottery. And then there's a very interesting, especially for people who deal with bioethics questions, notion of reciprocity. So, for example, in my world of peds oncology, so many kids enroll in clinical trials, should they get priority access over somebody who doesn't? But there's no consensus here. And so this leads us to this notion of weighing personal versus population health or public health ethics. So personal ethics, that's grounded on the patient-physician relationship, right? And at least here in the US, that's largely driven by this notion of autonomy or respect for persons. Public health ethics, our focus is not on the individual, rather, it's on the greater population as a whole. And here we think about things like distributive justice and utilitarianism. So with that background in mind, now let's go to the case. So you guys saw the case, but let's go over it just in case you forgot. Each one of you, I want you to imagine is a pediatric oncologist and you work at a busy place like here. And so far, you've been able to get by, you haven't had any shortages. But when you come to the clinic this morning, you're told that by the end of the week, you'll have gotten rid of your last dose of Incristin. And to make matters worse, the chemotherapy pharmacy director tells you that the usual avenues through which he's able to get additional drug aren't available because the primary supplier of Incristin has halted production, resulting in a national shortage. Now, who in here is in the pediatric oncology world? Anybody? We got some. Okay. So what you need to know about Incristin is it's kind of like water. We give it to anybody who walks in our clinic, they're probably going to get Incristin. Leukemias, lymphomas, solid tumors, bone tumors, brain tumors. It is probably the most frequently used drug that we have. And that's exactly what you realize when you review the current group of kids who are going to need it. Now, all of the kids are going to get the same milligram per meter squared dose, but because of their different sizes and body surface areas, some are going to get a higher dose, some are going to get a lower dose. Some are going to get it more frequently, some are going to get it less frequently based on their disease and based on their protocol. And to add one more layer of complexity, some of the kids are enrolled in research trials and get the Incristin as part of a clinical trial, some are getting standard of care. And so my question for you all is, how do you want to allocate your remaining bit of Incristin? And hopefully when it comes to thinking about how you're going to allocate this, I think you're starting to appreciate that the wrinkle or the dilemma of allocation is this, that was appreciated nearly 50 years ago by this philosopher who published it in an ethics journal. So this is you guys. So we're going to be quiet now. I'm going to hand the microphone over to Peter. And I want each one of you to think about how you want to allocate. So who gets it? And you can say whatever you want. Now, some people say that there's no right answer in ethics, and I would argue otherwise. I would say that the answer depends upon the justification for your answer. So you can say that the kid with purple hair and green freckles gets it, but you got to explain why you think that's the appropriate decision. And hopefully there's some brave people in the group, because if not, this is going to be a very short and very boring discussion. But I trust that you all have an opinion. Who wants to be the first brave soul? Who has an idea of how you want to allocate your Incristin? Yes. Give me a second to come over to you. And if you could just say your name.
Patients participating in clinical trials because they will likely be saving their life in the future.
Thank you, Andrew. So everybody hear that? So Andrew said that we should prioritize kids who are enrolled on clinical trials because they're going to be able to ultimately provide generalizable knowledge that will benefit others. Who else?
Yeah, I'm Alan Ringberg with the Berman Institute. I'm going to go with everybody's favorite answer with allocation choices to try to wriggle off the hook and look for other institutions that might have it out in the field and try to borrow some or whatever, call in favors.
So for hypothetical reasons, let's pretend we can't get any more, but since you had mentioned that, I'll give you an idea of a little bit of things that we do. So in our own institution, we do look to borrow when we can. Chances are, if we're not able to get it via the size of our hospital or our purchasing power, nobody can. But also on the ethical front is, you're pretty much guaranteed in your pharmacy to get random faxes saying, I've got in Christine for you, I'm happy to sell it to you from some no-name pharmacy that when you look on a Google map looks like it's, in a store that doesn't have a front, right? And so there is a gray market supply chain for drugs, and it's very tempting to do that. But part of the issue there is ensuring that you have the quality medications that you need. So those are some of the challenges that we deal with internally in the department.
So we've got prioritize for research and try to beg, borrow, and plead from others.
I just want to have a comment about the research use of giving it to people who are in clinical trials, and that is that it can influence a patient to go into a trial when it may be a more difficult situation for that person.
So that's a great point. So in ethics, we would call that undue inducement, right? And there's a whole spectrum of persuasion, manipulation, coercion, and do we want to really have people enroll in a trial because they're concerned that that's the only way that they'll get the drug, and not because they feel that that trial is best based on their values and preferences and other situations. So thank you, Dan, for mentioning that.
So I think one of the things that we want to think about in this scenario is that as consumers of healthcare in the U.S., it does not enter our minds that there would be something that we would not get access to. If there is something that's standard of care therapy, and especially about the mother of a child with cancer, what we are thinking at all times is if that medication is necessary for me or my child, I will have access. And here we're coming up to a situation where we may not have access to it. If we were living in Canada, we might understand that. And you're Israeli, and they have a nationalized healthcare system, and there may be other things that you are used to not having access to. I don't know how we can resolve that as Americans used to having whatever we need.
Although remember, this problem is mainly our problem. We own this problem more than any other country. Shortages exist elsewhere, but nowhere do they exist like they exist here.
Mark Hughes. So I'll ask a question, but it's also to try to get to a justification. What about giving it to either children who are the youngest, because they would have a greater opportunity for life if they are cured, longer lifespan, or probability of success? So there may be certain tumors that are more curable, and hence a better chance of success if you give it to those children.
So we can use essentially what Mark is suggesting is that we do a kind of either a quality adjusted or disability adjusted life year argument where, okay, you've got a 2-year-old versus a 20-year-old, and all else being equal, the 2-year-old has X number more years to live than the 20-year-old. Or we do it based on prognosis. Okay, good.
My name is Stephanie Stressman. I have a question. This is a drug that's standard of care right now, but are there other alternatives to this medication that perhaps are more expensive that could be given to patients whose insurance may cover those more expensive drugs, and we could look to give the rest of this allocation to people who perhaps can't afford a more expensive alternative?
Okay, so great question. Is there an alternative, right? So, for example, let's use something that maybe is a little closer to home. You've got an ear infection and you want to prescribe amoxicillin, but like we saw, there's a lot of antibiotic shortages. Maybe amox is in short supply, so you give ceftriaxone or something. And unfortunately, we don't have that luxury in most cases involving children with cancer. And compounding that is that we're very loath to practice anything that's not evidence-based. There are some other vinca alkaloids out there. There are some other drugs that belong to the same family that are maybe second cousins, but there's certainly no data to show what their role is. Let me give you just a short anecdote to kind of drive this home. So in 2009, there was a shortage of an old tried and true chemotherapeutic that was approved by the FDA in 1949 for treatment of some kids with Hodgkin lymphoma. That chemotherapeutic is called mechlorethamine. And at the time of the mechlorethamine shortage, evidence suggested that another chemo was as effective, cyclophosphamide. So 40 kids on a particular protocol got the alternative group that included the standard of care drugs with the cyclophosphamide instead of the mechlorethamine. Well, those kids had a 12.5% lower 2-year event-free survival than the kids who got the standard treatment. Those kids ended up getting much more therapy because some of them relapsed, including bone marrow transplantation, which is very toxic. So it's these kind of horror stories that pediatric oncologists, pharmacists, administrators have in the front. So your point is an excellent one. If there's an alternative, by all means, let's use it. But unfortunately, often there is not, and even if there is, there's no good data. I bet John could tell us about, even when there is good data, we're not used to using that drug with the other drugs, and it's not as frequent, so there's a much higher risk of errors, errors on the part of the docs, the nurses, the pharmacists, and so it's a very complicated thing. But your point is a good one. So this is kind of just to drive home that yes, even though there's an alternative, it may not be as easy as we think it is. Got a couple back there, Peter.
Could you explain a little more the dynamic behind this shortage? Like, I always assumed cancer is really big business and all the pharmaceuticals would love to produce a chemotherapy drug, and even if not that, the government would keep a stop on it.
So I can maybe take a crack at that, and that is a really important and very a big question with a very complicated answer. So long story short is it's a very complicated drug supply chain. And there's multiple factors that are probably leading to the reason that we're having shortages, particularly of generic injectables. One reason is there are issues with quality in some of the drug manufacturing plants. They're older plants, they haven't been updated for a long time, and so there are legitimate quality issues going on in some of those plants. Making generic injectables in particular can be challenging, and it's a highly regulated environment, and it's capital intensive. So upgrading those facilities hasn't been a top priority for generic manufacturers over the years, so we're left with old facilities that we've had plenty of quality issues over the past years as well with generic injectables. So that's one factor. The other is because of a lot of economic factors. There's a lot of consolidation in the generic pharmaceutical industry. Many of these companies are merging and eating up smaller companies, so you're left with just really big firms that may not be interested in manufacturing a drug that is used in a very small number of patients. And so there's business decisions that have led to this that are a result of the complicated marketplace that we're currently living in right now. That's another factor. Another factor is that a lot of the raw materials for these drugs are not made here in the United States. The active pharmaceutical ingredients predominantly are made in China or India, and the FDA is having a real challenging time trying to regulate the quality of the sources of those materials. So they might actually do the chemistry and make the API in China or India, and it gets shipped over here to another facility that might manufacture and formulate that into a sterile injectable product. So there are multiple factors, I think, that have converged over the time course that you saw on that slide, right around 2012, to start seeing this peak of problematic issues with generic drugs.
And there's actually, just to dovetail on what John said about this notion of the raw ingredients being made elsewhere, some of you may have seen just a couple months ago, there was a front page story in Bloomberg News about one of the Chinese plants that makes several ingredients for several drugs, but in this case a chemotherapeutic, Doxorubicin, and they had significant quality issues. The drugs still made it into our supply chain. So sometimes it's not only an issue of not having the drug, when you do get the drug, making sure that it is actually safe and has a good pedigree.
Right, and compound that with a lack of redundancy in manufacturing capability that exists. So if you have really 3 big firms that are making the entire U.S. supply of generic drug, and one company stops making it for one reason or another, business decision, quality problems in their plant, whatever that might be, if that's 30% of the U.S. supply, it is most commonly the case that the other 2 firms just can't turn on a switch and increase the volume needed. So that ends up producing a shortage period before some other manufacturer gets into the business of making it. And remember, like submitting an ANDA to the FDA, once you have all the work done and the science done to produce the drug, just getting that ANDA approved can take 2 years. So there's a very elongated time frame from the time point that somebody says, I want to make this, to the point that a pharmacy can actually buy it.
All right, how do you want to allocate? Research, age, prognosis?
Can I ask another question?
Sure.
How often is there a shortage here at Johns Hopkins?
So I can tell you, right now, we have a drug shortage committee that meets once a week. Large number of people that are constantly monitoring these types of situations. Right now on our list, there's somewhere between 100 and 150 drugs that we are actively monitoring. In other words, they've shown up on the shortage drug list at the FDA or ASHP, or we haven't received our usual shipments. And so right now we're in a mode where we're not too worried about it, but we didn't get our last shipment, so we're monitoring it closely. If you drill that down further, there's probably close to 50 drugs right now where we have some type of restriction in place, or some type of plan in place that was developed via a multidisciplinary effort to determine how we're either going to allocate or restrict or determine what is optimal use of that drug. So right now about 150 that we're monitoring, maybe about 50 where we have some type of restriction in place.
How many of you do that?
Do we need more federal oversight mechanisms?
Yes. Yeah, the question was, do we need more federal oversight mechanisms? So, some of people have heard me say that the government bailed out the auto industry, the government bailed out the home insurance companies, Freddie and Fannie. Why shouldn't they step in and do something with drug manufacturing? But how many people knew that there is a body within the Johns Hopkins system, much like there is at other hospitals, that was monitoring these drug shortages, and that there were close to 50 of the 150 that are a little bit more concerning? Do most people know that, or seems like there's just a few? Yeah, sir.
My name's Joe Margolis. Another, I don't know if this pertains to the drug you're discussing now, but there are genetic polymorphisms that affect how much drug a person needs in order to get a therapeutic effect, or sometimes even whether the drug should be given at all, whether it will work or not. If it needs to be metabolized or excreted or something, and there may be tests for that which may not ordinarily be used and may be expensive, but could be useful in the situation when you're allocating a scarce drug.
The wonderful suggestion about pharmacokinetics, really the individual, and seeing if they're a responder, slow, fast. Unfortunately, in this case, there's not anything readily available, but these are the types of things that we need to be thinking outside of the box. Any other ideas of how we want to allocate?
So to contrast with the more utility-focused proposal would be to say that we respect each person equally, and there's a lottery, so each person has the same chance to be treated.
So draw straws, essentially, right? Now, would that include first come, first serve?
one way to do that. A lottery group shows up first, or if you look at how the drug shortage is predicted to last, we might say there is X amount available at each given time, and then lotteries of timeframes.
So if we decide on a random so I think you're essentially suggesting a random allocation, right? Because I think that makes us feel better, right? We don't get that internal ick of, ooh, I didn't have to make that tragic choice. But I'd argue that some random allocation schema are better than others. And I would say that first come, first serve probably is not one of the ones that I would recommend. Mainly because, think about right now, you guys have information that you can act upon that somebody who wasn't here and doesn't know about the shortages know about. If any of you know how to which is like a maniac, and I'll get where I'm going much faster probably than 99% of you. And imagine that you have to get to the hospital, get your Scarce drugs, you have to take public transportation, you drive like a human being, right? And then really first come, first serve doesn't take into account need. So I hear what you're saying, and I think there is a role in very specific circumstances for a random approach, but I'd argue first come, first serve probably isn't one of them. Got a couple here and somebody in the back.
So perhaps you should look at those that are closer to being finished with the regimen. So instead of some getting a little, if you don't have an idea of how long the shortage is going to last, who are the ones that are likely to finish the regimen?
So you would prioritize to the ones who are going to finish, or you would prioritize, or you would deprioritize because they're almost done and they've already gotten the bulk of the med.
No, I think I would prioritize to those who are going to. If the plan is that you need X number of treatments in order to get the benefit, then those who would be likely to finish the treatment.
Okay.
That's the point I was going to raise. Must be something.
Great minds. We got somebody way in the back, Peter. So I just as Peter's walking back there, I think an argument could be made though that you deprioritize, right? If you've got a kid with ALL who's had almost 3 years of treatment and gotten vincristine all the time, maybe they don't need those last 3 doses.
My question is whether you tell people there's a shortage, whether the patients know, and whether they ever get to be involved in the decision. Are people ever altruistic and say give it to somebody else?
So what do you think? Should we be telling?
I suspect we don't.
No, you should be at the debate tomorrow. You didn't answer my question. What do you think? Should we be telling patients and parents? And I agree. You have to, right? I mean, imagine, first of all, lies are hard to cover up. Imagine that you didn't tell and the patient or the parent comes back to you and says, hey, what's about this shortage and how come I didn't get this? You know, they get 4 drugs sometimes in one visit and they don't necessarily know what they got. So you have to, yeah, I mean, I think every one of the people who has some kind of schema in mind, and I'll share with you towards the end, I'll share with you what our group has come up with. But every group talks about being transparent, so yes.
Hi, Anita Tarson from outside of the campus. Have you ever thought about maybe what they do with organ allocation for kidneys, where you do a top, like some kind of calculation for the top percentage that are likely to benefit, and then you put the others in a pool where you do some kind of random selection for the rest?
So I think that so look at what other people do who have to allocate other types of resources, right? So things like organs, things like ICU beds, things like ventilators, things like vaccines, and base that on, I mean, we're clinicians, we like algorithms, we like data, so I think that speaks up also to what Mark was suggesting about a prognosis. So yeah, you look at the data, look at the numbers, look at benefit.
Hi, my name's Anna. The question is that, isn't first come, first serve sort of a necessity, an evil necessity in a way, because you don't have a finite pool of people. I mean, you can't say, oh, we're going to do a lottery, but only on these people who are already here. You can, obviously. and then that's your answer, and that is essentially first come, first serve. Are you talking about, setting drug aside so that you can evaluate the need of someone who has yet to come in?
So it's a good point and question about the pros and cons of first come, first serve. So one of the things, and I'll tell you about this when I go over the model that we proposed, was you have to know who your population is. All centers know how many new patients they get each year, what those breakdown of those diagnoses are, and that's part of being a good steward and planning for that. That you certainly, I don't think that first come, first serve, for some of the reasons that I suggested, on its own is a good model. You could say that you're not doing first come, first serve, and maybe have that kind of an approach for those patients that you know you're due to come to your center. For example, if you know that you get 20 kids each year with ALL, you need to plan for that. And I suppose you could say maybe that is first come, first serve, but I think of that more as being aware of your current and expected patients.
So I guess I'm wondering about those that have the hospice designation and people that are still receiving therapy when we know that they probably will not be alive in 6 months.
So what are you suggesting?
I suggest that they don't receive the meds and it goes to someone else.
So this is, think about the election last time, right? This is the death panels, right? Essentially, we're becoming death panels. And there's actually been, the chairman of the Children's Oncology Group, Peter Adamson at CHOP, has actually been quoted in the national media saying the shortages are causing individual clinicians to become essentially a death panel. Now, I don't need to tell you, as somebody who deals with end-of-life patients on a daily basis, that for some patients and parents, they want to keep fighting until the end. And at least in our medical system here, leveraging what Terry suggested, we allow that to happen. So does that mean that, remember, somebody, because we've agreed, based on our colleague in the back, that we have to be transparent. So somebody's going to have to tell that dying patient that, hey, we're not giving you drug, we're giving it to the kid who's got a better chance of survival. Think about what that discussion might look like.
We do that with organs all the time.
We do. Organs are a finite resource, right? Until those 3D printers are up and can do that, your point is well taken. But drugs and medicines are not, for all intents and purposes, in the same manner a finite resource like a kidney or a liver or something like that. So a couple more, and then we'll segue into, I'll tell you what a group that I've been working with has come up with.
So I think another thing that we have to keep in mind is that a lot of these suggestions may increase disparities based on race and income. So I do research on transplants, and we find that even with these really fancy algorithms, we still have racial and geographic and income-based disparities. And I think first come, first serve is a really obvious example of that, but some of these other suggestions as well, such as prognosis, may also be really closely linked to access to medical care and more privileged access to high-quality care in a more timely fashion. So that's just another complicating factor.
So the proverbial social determinants of health. Yeah, great point. There's just a couple more maybe, and then we'll.
I'm sorry, going back to something you said earlier, would you mind clarifying in what way this medical shortage is different from the shortages faced by organ transplant centers?
So the primary difference is that organs are truly a finite resource. You require either pick your organ of choice. You say to kidney, you need those donors. You need those 123,000 people who are waiting for that organ, and there's not enough of them. Medications are something that at least until 2001, we we never really experienced significant shortages to the degree that we are now, and the fact that we have many other countries in the world that have no shortages at all supports that. I mean, one of the things that the FDA does under dire circumstances is borrow drugs from non-US countries to give to US citizens. And those countries have the drug, hence they borrow it. So that's the primary difference. You could argue, sorry.
No, I was just, to clarify, you say the primary difference is in the public perception of the nature of the shortage. That medical shortages are something people are less familiar with and therefore less likely to comprehend?
No. I'm saying that an organ is a finite resource in the sense that it's not able to be produced in the same fashion as a drug. You can't have a manufacturing line to make a kidney. You can do that with a drug. We have the ability to have a production line to make a drug. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Okay. All right, we'll take one more and then I'll share with you what we've come up with and see what you like.
So I'm hoping maybe this will be part of what you share, but it seems to me the real ethical imperative here that would take care of this is to prevent the shortage in the first place. And I realize that's a complicated thing, but I'm sure you've thought about what the best approaches would be for this kind of prevention, or what the hospital, or what practitioners, or what the medical profession, or what the society in general need to do, and I hope you'll share that with us.
So that's a great segue. Thank you to those of you who participated. There's an extra bottle of water up here for each one of you. Let me grab that from you, Peter. So there's no question that the solution to the shortages is prevention. And I've been part of a multidisciplinary transnational working group looking at these issues within childhood cancer. There's other people who have done that. I mean, the reason that you have this group of panelists is not by accident. What you see here is a microcosm of the type of people who are going to be required to solve these shortages by preventing them, right? Think about who the stakeholders are. Government, industry, patients and patient advocates, professional organizations, et cetera, and more and more and more. Each one of these has a different goal in mind. And so until that can happen, though, we're unfortunately forced with this horrible decision. So we have published, and what's one of the references I think on the flyer in 2014, six recommendations, and each recommendation has multiple sub-recommendations of how to prevent these. Some of them have gained traction, some of them have not. And so until that can happen, though, let me tell you what a group that I led came up with. So within Children's Oncology Group, which is kind of the mothership for most kids with cancer in North America, we realized that we needed some guidance. We needed guidance because oncologists were telling us that they didn't know how to allocate. So we came up with a two-tiered process based on mitigation, maximizing efficiency and minimizing waste, and the prioritization model that we came upon was a modified utilitarian model that we want to maximize benefit according to life saved or life years saved. So that's ethics speak. So let's see what it really looks like. So a couple of years ago, there was a shortage of water in California, right? And so any shortage, the first thing you do is tighten the belt. So people stopped watering their lawn every day. They watered twice a week. They watered once a week. They stopped watering. They went from a grass lawn to a rock garden. So the first thing that you need to do in a shortage is tighten the belt. But some of the things that John alluded to make this actually not as straightforward as it may seem. In order for everybody to do this the right way, everybody has to have the same information. So John and his pharmacy may get an email saying, hey, there's a shortage and we can get you drugs, and at my pharmacy at Sinai, we may not have that information, and the way that the information about shortages is disseminated, believe it or not, it's not so straightforward. There's no one clearinghouse. The fact that you've got FDA that lists X number of drugs in short supply, and the American Society of Health Systems Pharmacists that lists X plus 50, because they define drugs in a different way, I think speaks to that. So the first step that we talk about is really tightening the belt, but making sure that it's a level playing field and have everybody on the same page. Now, I'm not going to go through each one of our recommendations. The list, the article is there for you to look at, but let me just give you a bit of a taste. So the first thing that we talk about is viewing these shortages as a natural disaster or a natural emergency. So shortages could affect just Baltimore, shortages could affect just Maryland, shortages, as in the case we presented to you, could affect the entire country. When we view these shortages, though, as a natural disaster or natural emergency, that actually allows for changes that allow for policy level changes or remediation. An example of that was a few years ago, the FDA imported a vaccine against bacterial meningitis when there was an outbreak at some US colleges that we didn't have in the US. But unless it's declared an emergency, think about the Civil Guard and the Coast Guard that comes out, not the Coast Guard, the Civil Guard that comes out in a natural disaster. So we need to do the same thing. You guys brought this up when we spoke about hoarding. So I sit on my hospital's drug shortage committee, and we meet in the most secure room in the hospital, and the walls are lined by boxes of short drugs. I'm not going to ask John if that's the case here. I don't want to put him on the spot. But I can tell you at my hospital, Sinai, we do that. The pharmacists have boxes of drugs that are short supply. And we know from data that 85% of hospitals purchase excess inventory in response to a shortage. So here's where we need to rely on our industry colleagues, the pharmaceutical company. If they know that Sinai only orders 1,000 milligrams of Incristin a month, and Hopkins orders 10,000 milligrams a month, and suddenly at Sinai we're ordering 10,000, they should say, whoa, right? You're not a Hopkins-sized hospital. You don't need that much. They should serve as a gatekeeper. So that's one of the recommendations that we have. We spoke about this just a second ago, this notion of anticipating and knowing who your patient base is. So if you know that you get 20 new patients a year or 200 new patients a year, you need to plan for that. And that's really important for high priority drugs. So Incristin for kids with ALL in that first 6 weeks of treatment, or a drug called pegasparaginase, things like that, you need to plan. And some people may say that that's actually stockpiling. I'd argue that's not stockpiling, that's being a good steward. This notion of cohorting, number 5, is a really interesting one. So because many of these shortages, remember, involve sterile generic injectables, they're dispensed oftentimes in what's called single-use vials. It's kind of like a bottle of champagne, right? Once you open it, the idea is to finish it because you can't recap it because it goes bad. So because of sterility reasons, you can't really, although my pharmacy colleagues tell me that under the right conditions, you probably could do it for up to 24 hours, but there's legal ramifications. So you're supposed to open it and then use it and throw away what's left. And what's especially vexing here in the United States is, unlike other countries where oftentimes they will distribute that drug in a smaller vial so you don't waste it, here we're supersized land. They sell oftentimes only a much bigger vial. So I'll give you an example, Methotrexate. We use this in oncology for intrathecal, for giving spinal prophylaxis. The maximum dose that somebody's going to get is 15 milligrams. The smallest vial size is 50. And so you give 15 milligrams, you got 35 left, you toss it. So what people have done is they bring kids together who may not be due to get it yet, but you don't want to waste this commodity, this valuable commodity, and you give it. The problem is you don't know if by giving it a week early or a week late, you're going to have a problem for that kid. Number 7 here, you guys mentioned this. That's one of the solutions to the shortages, this notion of borrowing and sharing drug. How come if I have a shortage at Sinai, I can't call John and say, hey John, I need some Incristin, can you lend me some? And then 2 weeks later he says, hey Yoram, I need some Doxorubicin, can you lend me some? Well, there's a lot of reasons that you can't do it. One is that there's actually laws in place that prevent, at least across state lines, from sharing drugs. So the way that drugs are distributed nationally varies. So shortages happen at different times, at different places, and different rates across the country. So it's not uncommon that you could have a shortage in Maryland, but not in Virginia. But because of the laws about intercommerce state transfer of drugs exist to prevent that from happening, it's hard. And then you could also think about if you're the CEO of Hopkins or Sinai. You don't want there to be a story in the Baltimore Sun saying, kid at Hopkins, kid at Sinai couldn't get drug because they didn't have enough. And you're gonna, right, we all do that. I mean, we've all been at the supermarket when there's an announcement about a snowstorm, right? And what do? You buy batteries, you buy coffee, you buy hot sauce, you buy whatever's important to you. And people do the same thing with drugs. And so the optics of this, are, it's a complicated thing, like John said. Maybe we need to give a lower dose, you skip a dose, you give a dose out of sequence. Again, we don't know what the heck that means, but these are some of the things that we recommend. And then really we need to think outside the box. So, these anecdotes are important. I'm not trying to be funny, but I think they drive home the point. We've all been in that situation where it's 12:05 at night and you're thirsty and you walk down to your refrigerator and you want a drink and you grab the milk jug and you look and it says expired at 11:59, meaning 6 minutes ago. Now if you're like me, you just kind of go and you drink it anyway, right? Nothing has happened. My daughters, they won't touch it. They think that miraculously it's suddenly become bad. Maybe we need, in these tragic situations, maybe we need to do that with drugs. Now John will tell you, correctly so, that that's illegal. You're not allowed to do that. But if we have a natural disaster, a natural emergency, maybe we need to use drugs that have just gone bad. And by the way, sometimes these drugs are what are shipped to so-called developing countries, and they use expired drugs all the time. What about actual allocation and prioritization? So allocation decisions should be reasoned, they should be transparent, explicit, and they should be public. And the idea behind that is the public needs to know that we didn't just come up with these decisions willy-nilly, but that there's some thought behind them. So we feel within the COG task force that I work with that we should focus on two things. We should focus on this modified utilitarian model, this idea of inherently it's better to save more lives than not. And this is a type of model that's been used throughout the past 100 years or so for other scarce resources. Things like ICU beds, influenza vaccines, responses to various natural disasters and things like that. So again, I'm not going to go through every one of them, I'm just going to focus on a few of them. Remember, these shortages mean that we can't give kids, or some kids, the standard of care that they would otherwise get, and therefore their prognosis is compromised. And although we don't like to think about it, as clinicians, we like to think that we can cure everybody. This goes to Mark and Anita's point about curability. So one of our recommendations is that we actually do enact this notion of what we call a threshold of curability. So imagine you have two kids, one with an 80% chance and one with a 40% chance of cure. Maybe you give that drug to the kid with the 80% chance of cure. Now, we're very clear that it's rare that we have these degrees of precision. Usually it's 70-60. Right? How are you going to do that? And so unless you have very large margins, you shouldn't do this. But this is in those instances where you do have that, maybe that's something your center wants to do. We really need to focus on the data. So osteosarcoma is a good example of what I mean by that. It's the most common bone tumor in children. And here in the United States and Canada, part of the cocktail of drugs that we use is methotrexate, a drug that has been short on more than one occasion. Our European counterparts don't use methotrexate, and their outcomes are no different. So one of the recommendations we have is, in the future, next time we have methotrexate shortage, it's not used for osteosarcoma. We divert it to diseases where there's better data for its role, ALL, non-Hodgkin lymphoma, thing like that. We really need to know how important a particular drug is to the given patient. So a lot of teenagers and adolescents can develop a tumor called a germ cell tumor. Well, a drug called cisplatin is really, really important. That same drug, cisplatin, probably is not as important in some other diseases where it's used, for example, like neuroblastoma. By the same token, and this goes to, and I don't remember who it was, over here, somebody, about deprioritizing. So if you know that you've got a kid with ALL, I gave this example before, who's getting 3 years of chemo. They get vincristine all the time. Remember, it's like water. Maybe if you've got a kid who's 2 years into it, they don't need more vincristine, and you give it to the kid who's at the beginning. So you got to know where the kid is and what their disease is. The number 5 is really important. One of the concerns is that people are going to focus primarily on diseases that have a good outcome, right? The 80%, not the 40%. But we have to remember that that kid with a 40% chance of cure, that drug may be their only chance at beating the disease. And so here an example is a drug called Doxorubicin for kids who have diseased sarcomas, tumors of the muscles and the soft tissues. That Doxorubicin should be diverted to that kid with a sarcoma versus a kid with a Hodgkin lymphoma, because the kid with a Hodgkin lymphoma gets 6 or 7 other drugs and has a much better outcome anyway. Now, it may sound a little surprising coming from a pediatric oncologist who all we do is clinical research. I mean, most kids with pediatric oncology enroll on trials. But we do not, and this goes to Andrea's point who stepped out, we do not recommend prioritizing for kids on trial. And the reason for that is one of the things that I alluded to, this concern over undue inducement. Also, there are concerns over public perception. Imagine that, again, the Sun gets wind of the fact that kids with cancer who enroll in trials get priority access over those who don't. And that's not necessarily what we want to do. And really, we've got to focus on the data. Remember, these drugs, although they may be potentially beneficial, it hasn't been proven yet. Okay? So this is just a table, and I'll show it at the end. It just summarizes some of the things I said. So like it or not, rationing is here to stay. And we know from data that oncologists in particular don't know how to ethically allocate these drugs. Now, I want to say something again, and this goes to the last comment we had of the gentleman a few rows back about prevention. Neither our schema about allocation or any of the other ones that exist is a solution to these shortages. The solutions is to prevent them. But until we can prevent them, and until at least there can be some kind of national policy advisory statement on how to allocate, we need to do something. And so we think that these recommendations, including some of the things that you guys said, for example, is the solution right now because they're defensible, they're nuanced, and although the emphasis here is on peds oncology, they certainly apply more broadly to other fields of medicine. So that's what we got. I think we're sticking around for a few more minutes, right, for questions if anybody has anything, and I'll show this again. Thank you.
The generic manufacturing paradigm needs to be brought into the 21st century. And the FDA is trying to encourage those types of things, but getting to a point where we can leverage new techniques that exist from a technological perspective and apply them to the manufacturing process so that we can have advances in manufacturing processes and advances in regulatory science such that we can shorten the duration and lower the barriers to entry for people to make drugs. I think that would be a healthy thing to promote better competition, because right now we're in an environment where there are people ready to buy it, but nobody is making it. And that's sort of not the way things usually work in a very functioning marketplace, and that's why we don't see these problems in other countries right now. So part of the issues are embedded in our complex regulatory scheme. It's also embedded in our complex infrastructure for how we purchase drugs. And I think to a degree we need to be a little introspective on that as well. Hospitals like ours, for a very good reason, have formed big group purchasing organizations to try to conglomerate our buying power. That's a good thing because it's reducing our cost of care. We're able to pass that on to patients. But when you have a GPO, maybe 4 or 5 big ones that are basically bringing all the generic manufacturers in, who are they going to pick? They're not going to pick a small manufacturer that's just getting started up. They're going to pick only the guy that can produce a very large volume on a very reliable basis. So that automatically excludes some other people that might be willing to compete in that marketplace. And so is that an untoward consequence of sort of what we're doing with amassing buying power? So I think those things are all on the table for consideration. But I do think advances in the technology and advances in the regulatory science would at least get us part of the way to look at that.
Related to the technology, so there is a recent bill that was passed called the Track and Trace Bill. So one of the concerns is this notion of having to be able to follow the pedigree of the drug. And if you do want to allow sharing, for example, between Virginia and Maryland, this technology allows the drug to be traced from its point of origin to the distribution center to its endpoint at the local hospital pharmacy. And so it's the technological things, even as simple as that, just a barcode, which will potentially alleviate, that doesn't prevent the shortage from happening, but that allows at least for more just distribution and sharing. Any questions? Wow, we totally bummed everybody up.
I just had a question on some comments you made. So the first slide, you were saying how these are problems not of autonomy in classic 20th century medical ethics, but a public concern, so that we're not considering individual patients' choices, but rather having choices for a population. But at the same time, you were also pushing back against that pandemic notion that we shouldn't be making these decisions or telling someone they can't have something. So how are you reconciling these two ethical views that you've been expressing?
Well, Well, I wasn't pushing back necessarily on death panels, I was raising the point of what the controversy was at the time. The point, I'll answer your question in the following way. I will say that, and it didn't come up, and thank you for raising this question. So what does the group think about bedside decision making? And that's actually one of the questions on the flyer. Should clinicians be making bedside decision making, right? So Dr. X and I have my patient, if my patient needs a short drug that's a scarce supply, should I be the one making that decision? How many people say yes? Raise your hand. How many people say no? Raise your hand. Everybody has to vote. It's not like Chicago. So, I mean, it looks like the overwhelming majority think no, and I'm glad to see that. So bedside decision making is problematic because it's prone to subjective preferences. It's right. Of course I'm going to advocate for my patient. That's my job. I mean, I would argue that it's unethical if you're not advocating for your patient. But in this type of a situation, these types of decisions need to be removed from the individual at the bedside, and they need to be made by a neutral panel. And I love the words that John used when he talked about the committee here at Hopkins, which is similar to the makeup of the one that we have at Sinai too. It's a multidisciplinary group of people that includes, all sizes and shapes. Clinicians, psychosocial, patient advocates, pharmacy, nursing, you name it. And those are the type of people who need to make that decision. So you can call that a death panel, and if you want to, fine. And in some ways it probably is a death panel. But that committee also needs to include an appeals process. That's an important component. Anybody should be who has skin in the game, be it the clinician or the patient or that patient surrogate, should be able to appeal. It may not at the end make a difference, just like when the Supreme Court hears something, they may rule with the initial decision, but there has to be an appeals process. So that's how I answer it. Okay, thank you guys.